A charge, tá luthar mhór orm, trúr mór scoláirí de chuid an léon éireannaí a chur in Mhuir Moira D. Anrahan is Professor Emeritus of Irish in UCD and joins us today from her spiritual home in the Isle of Skye. Brian Lacey is a PhD alumnus of Ulster University and a leading authority on the life of Colmcille and his disciple, Aunan. Mairead McCry is a former colleague of mine here at Ulster's Magee campus and is Professor of Cultural Heritage and Anthropological Studies at Heriot-Watt University, Edinburgh. Each speaker will seek to examine the role of Colmcille as an icon of shared heritage. Moira considering the Gaelic literatures of Ireland and Scotland. Brian focusing on the life of Colmcille as depicted in various sources. And Mairead revisiting an analysis of Colmcille which she first published on the eve of 2013 and the City of Culture celebrations here in Derry. And chiad cainteoir linn anish, ón Uileán Scíochanach and Talu Moira ní Anrahan.
As attendees at this conference know, we're celebrating the importance of Colmcille, or St. Columba, in this, the 1500th anniversary of his birth in Donegal. In this short pre-recorded piece, I'd like to consider his importance for the Gaelic world in particular, primarily Ireland and Scotland. This is not to limit his reach to those two countries. He was known widely across Europe in the medieval period, as we can see from the beautiful liturgies in his honour, manuscripts associated with him, and churches dedicated to him. Today, though, it's to be Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland. To recall a specific historical personage from so long ago, and to consider him still important and worth venerating, is by any standards significant. It is appropriate that all the resources of the various relevant academic disciplines be brought to bear to unearth the historical truth of his life and early responses to it. I'm referring here to history, archaeology, linguistics, textual criticism, musicology, and so on. But it is also important to acknowledge the salient point that one of the indisputable facts about Colmcille is that for whatever changing constellation of reasons, he has captured the imagination of people on these islands who have constructed him as a towering figure, a leader worthy of our attention and our admiration for a millennium and a half now. I'd like to suggest three reasons for his significance and his potential for Gaelic speakers in Ireland and Scotland today. The first is his symbolic status. Colmcille was not the first Irish person to travel to what is now known as Scotland, nor was he the first Christian to arrive there, far from it. But he is remembered as having introduced Christianity from Ireland as a unifying force. Even though he did not single-handedly convert the people of Scotland, he is symbolic of that shared religious tradition and is also symbolic of the shared Gaelic tradition of the two, let's say, countries that carried that conversion, and that conversation and that conversion have continued ever since. The first is his symbolic status. Colmcille was not the first Irish person to travel to what is now known as Scotland, nor was he the first Christian to arrive there, far from it. But he is remembered as having introduced Christianity from Ireland. He did not single-handedly convert the people of Scotland, but he is symbolic of that shared religious tradition, and he is also symbolic of the shared Gaelic tradition that carried that conversion. And the Gaelic tradition has continued ever since. Colmcille encapsulates and stands for it in the imagination. You could say that if he didn't exist, we would have to create him. Now, one symbol opens the door for others, and others followed Colmcille. We have had subsequent personages, mythical and historical, who stand out as figures that span the Irish-Scottish spectrum. At least two of them were martial. Cuchulainn looms very large. He was the Ulster hero with supernatural powers who came to Scotland to learn the arts of war from a very skilled woman called Scoth, who also had magical powers. This happened, supposedly, in a castle that's now ruined just a few miles from where I am recording this on the Isle of Skye. A perfectly ordinary ruined castle that changed hands more than once between competing clans, but it's now deemed the place where our great hero came to learn warfare. Alistair MacCulloch was another figure. He was an early modern figure who belonged to a family whose activities spanned Ireland and Scotland. His own warlike activities and attributes have inspired a good deal of attention, and he stands out as an Irish-Scottish figure. He has generated much in the oral tradition. In the 20th century, the shared Gaelic culture of Scotland and Ireland has inspired a third important type of symbol, neither religious like Colmcille, nor warlike like Cuchulainn or Colkitto, but one that relates primarily to romantic love and also to culture in its own right. The unforgettable poet Sorlia MacGillan, or Sorlia MacLean, whose love for a young Irish woman in the 1930s unleashed a sequence of transcendent lyric poetry that was deeply rooted in ancient Gaelic tradition, very ancient, but was also completely modern and global in its scope. Although the woman's identity is well known, I prefer not to name her here because MacLean himself took pains not to identify her in his poetry. And then his brother, Callum Ian MacLean, was a notable folklorist who worked widely in Ireland and Scotland, and he's contributed significantly to our understanding of the shared treasure of oral tradition. This trio, the MacLean brothers and the Irish woman, have a strong claim to symbolic status as recent embodiments of ongoing Gaelic connections. And none of the figures I have mentioned is an empty symbol. They all emerge from a genuine wellspring of shared culture, all linguistic, and after that, either religious, military, or poetic. The second area in which Colmcille speaks to us relates to exile and identity. Colmcille was an exile. He left Ireland to atone for the lost souls who died in a battle he felt responsible for, and he promised that he would bring 3 times their number to Christianity in Scotland. I'll come back to that later. We're told that the birds followed his boat from Derry, which is of course the virtual centre of this conference. They went up Loch Foyle, weeping and shrieking at their grief as he left. There are poems ascribed to him that refer to his own grief. One beautiful poem, Phil Suilmas, A Grey Eye Looks Back, has a tone that is elegiac and unbearably sad. He will never again, he says, see Ireland, its men and its women. And he and his monks travelled by sea until they found a spot in Iona where Ireland could no longer even be seen, and that was a prerequisite for them. It was exile. And that is what tradition chooses to remember. But for us, Colmcille can connote the opposite of exile. I refer here to the extraordinary sense of recognition and affinity that Colmcille stands for, and that is renewed by Irish speakers when they encounter Scottish Gaelic, and by Scottish Gaelic speakers when they encounter Irish. it can be for many people as though a part that we didn't even realize that had been lost has been found, a part of ourselves. And because the two languages are, we can call them two types of the one Gaelic language, because they're not entirely identical, this shared culture expands our sense of ourself and leads to a redefinition of Gaelic. I don't have time here to explore either the unmistakable echoes back and forth in language, in sensibility, in history, in imagination, in religion, and nor can I speak of the differences in those areas. But I know that they do not destroy our commonality. They expand it into something wider and more spacious. And today, when some fear that Brexit threatens to unravel the close, friendly, and collaborative ties between these islands within the European Union, the strength of the Gaelic stream of continuity is a precious gift to all. For those who live right across the island of Ireland today, north and south, Colmcille is a rebuke to sectarianism and a beacon of non-violent recourse to spiritual strength. More generally, Colmcille's enduring importance shows us that cultural affinity does not respect borders. For him, the land of exile became his home. In cultural and linguistic terms, our home is neither Ireland nor Scotland, but the two together, referred to in a recent map as Tír Colmcille, Colmcille's land. The shortest geographical distance between Ireland and Scotland is about the same as the width of Loch Ness. The cultural and linguistic Gaelic continuum recognizes how tiny the distance is in a way that current political structures do not. The obvious implication here is that this precious gift needs constant support and affirmation. Our celebration of Colmcille this year is a small part of that. We hope the governments will do more. I should also add that when I refer to the identity of Irish and Scottish Gaelic speakers, I do mean precisely that, those who speak the languages or indirectly associate themselves with them. I do not mean any blood relationship or nationality. His complexity is the third reason I'm suggesting for us to engage with Colmcille today. We hold him to have been of royal lineage, to have been an artist, both as poet and scribe, and to have been a priest and a monk, but with definite undertones of the older pre-Christian belief system. Altogether, that's a form of complexity. Another type involves conversion. The conversion experience of saints is central to hagiography, and the abandonment of worldly interests and pursuits is one of its main manifestations. In Colmcille's case, he became a monk early in life and founded many monasteries. But unlike many, though not all, saints, in embracing the life of a monk, he did not seem to fully disengage with his artistic and political roles. To some extent, their coexistence within him was fruitful. Say, in the prayers he composed or is said to have composed, which drew on his artistic and religious sides, or perhaps his adjudication in favor of poets in a certain dispute, which would appear to have recognized his political stature as well as his artistic commitments. But the coexistence of these various aspects of himself also led to great strife, requiring great atonement in his 40s. Because he copied a manuscript and refused to return the copy, a judgment was made against him to the effect that to each cow her calf and to each manuscript its copy. This eventually led to outright war, with the manuscript as, at the very least, the pretext. This, in turn, led to the atonement of exile, whether freely chosen or imposed, and as a felix culpa or happy fault, that in turn led eventually to the Christianization of whole chunks of what is now known as Great Britain. Less spectacularly, he is reported to have had many small conversion experiences. His reputed stinginess was cured when he realized that a beggar to whom he had refused alms turned out to be Christ. Admittedly, that is a hagiographical commonplace. Insofar as he was impatient and irritable, it is reported that he generally directed his ire towards others who had either lied or were ungenerous. And he was more or less along the lines there of the stricter biblical prophets. But he often repented of his hastier actions. He held his ground firmly. He had a competitive streak. He wielded power. He was far from the milk and water image of the saints we sometimes harbour. He changed with time. He moved forward. He innovated. So for these reasons, his symbolic value as a Scottish-Irish embodiment of Gaelic culture, and then the invitation he represents to claim and rejoice in the nuanced variations in Gaelic language and culture across a broader span than our separate countries. And finally, because of his embrace of multiple interlinked identities and roles and his willingness to change, I believe he commands our attention. Thank you.
Gur maithigid as sin a bhaire. An darna caintúir inis, liom sa hala an seo, tá an Dr. Brian Lacey.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in McGee College, where I got my own first academic job many, many years ago. I'm very grateful to the organisers of this conference, but particularly to Professor Malik O'Neill for the invitation to speak. And this is an important occasion for us in the terms of anniversary, because the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St. Colmcille, who is the patron saint of Derry, where we are. But many people don't know, but nowadays we think of the patron saint of Ireland as St. Patrick. But in fact, there were three patron saints of Ireland in medieval times: St. Patrick, St. Bridget, and St. Colmcille. And St. Colmcille, that's his name in Irish. In Latin, he's known as Columba. And these are his dates that we have, that he was born. We have two sets of dates there on the screen: traditional dates and revised dates, according to the research of Dr. Dan McCarthy. They're very slight differences. But he was probably born in the year 520 on the 7th of December, as it happens. And he left Ireland to go to Scotland in 562, founded the great monastery of Iona in 563, and then died probably in 593. And next week, the 9th of June, we'll be celebrating the day of his death, which is also his feast day. So that's rather important. Now, one of the things, when Colmcille went to Iona with his monks, one of the very first things they did was they started recording details, like notes about things going on back home in Ireland. And these eventually developed into what we now call the Annals of Ulster, or possibly better known now, the Annals of the Four Masters. And because they recorded these details, that's the very beginnings of Irish and indeed of Scottish history, the first recording of actual events, as distinct from, if you like, older mythologies and legends. These are factual events. And for instance, I thought, because we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, I thought you might be interested to see this. These are all the pandemics and storms and plagues, etc., that occurred during Colmcille's own lifetime. And there's lots of them there. I'm not going to go down through them, but you can see. Now, we only know that because Colmcille himself and the monks that went with him to Iona in 562 or thereabouts began to record these details. And that's really very important for us. Now, Colmcille has been written about and sung about and made statues about and so on and so forth right through the whole of the 1,500 years since he was born. And we have to distinguish, there's a huge body of knowledge about him, but we have to distinguish, as it were, between two characters. And one of them is what I call the fictional figure, the figure of legend, folklore, hagiography, stories, statues, stained glass windows, etc. And then there's the real historical person, the real person who lived for most of the 6th century. Now, Colmcille's major monastery was on Iona. Iona is a tiny little island off the shore of a slightly bigger island, Iona off the shore of Mull, which is itself off the west coast of Scotland, and it's there. And you can see, we now, of course, think of modern political divisions. There's Scotland, there's Ireland, there's England, etc. Of course, back then there weren't such things. There were no divisions of that nature. And Iona was, rather than being on the edge of anywhere, Iona was in a sense in the centre of kind of an archipelago of islands and pieces of the mainland, so on and so forth. And when he goes to Iona, there's all sorts of influences. And we know, for instance, if you go through Scotland now, there's about 57, sort of 60 sites in Scotland that are dedicated to St. Colmcille, has his name as part of them, or something of that nature. Now, these would have been ancient monasteries, ancient churches, not all of them founded by the saint, but possibly by his followers and people who just honoured him. So there's about 56, 57, 60 or so in Scotland. There's about 37 in the whole island of Ireland. There's also a few places of importance in England. I emphasise the island of Lindisfarne, which is just north of the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. And then Durham Cathedral, the great cathedral at Durham, which preserved the cult of Colmcille and manuscripts about him and so on and so forth. Now, Iona, when you go to Iona today, there's not very much there today from the ancient monastery, because, in fact, in about 1200, a huge new, later medieval abbey was built on top of the ancient monastery. So we don't have very much evidence of the ancient one. But there are a few things from that, such as the crosses there, St. John's Cross and St. Martin's Cross, and they date to roughly between about 750 and 800. Now, all over Ireland particularly, but in other places, as we'll see, the name Colmcille is used as the patron of all sorts of things. That's a school in County Donegal. But here's a church on Manhattan, and West 25th Street in Manhattan, dedicated to St. Columba. And here, this maybe more interestingly, this is in the city of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And here this in fact is a St. Columba Presbyterian youth group, which is just beside a Church of Tanzania, Presbyterian Church of Tanzania church in the city of Dar es Salaam. So his fame has spread, particularly in the 19th century, where both Irish and Scottish emigrants went, or missionaries, in this case probably a missionary. Now, how do we know anything about this man who lived in the 6th century? Well, a number of medieval texts were written about him. And this is the first one. This is the so-called Vita Columbae. It's written in Latin, written by a man called Adovnon, who was the 9th abbot of Iona, and it was written about the year 700 AD. Now, that manuscript is a really, really important Irish manuscript, but it doesn't survive in Ireland. It is housed in a library in this little town of Schaffhausen in Switzerland. But it shows how the cult of the Saint Columba spread across Ireland, across Scotland, England, and then on to the continent. And then a little bit later, here in Derry, where we are, another life of the saint, and this time in Irish, Baha Colmcille, written around about 1150, 1160, that sort of date. And actually, it's a sermon for delivery on the 9th of June. The 9th of June, as I said, is the feast day of St. Columba. And it's actually the oldest book that we know that was written here in Derry. You've been hearing in the conference about all sorts of literary people connected with the city of Derry, but that is the oldest book that we know of that was written in Derry. And then another few hundred years passes, and then a major book is written about Columba by a man called Manus O'Donnell. And Manus, about a few years after he finished this book, Manus became the Taoiseach, or the Tíorna, the Lord of County Donegal, the next county to us here. And that, the manuscript there has in the front of it a portrait, a painting of the saint. And it's anachronistic. It shows Colmcille as he would have looked maybe in the 16th century rather than the 6th. But that picture is the oldest portrait we have that was, from County Donegal. And in some of the manuscripts, but not all of them, in the manuscripts of that, of Adamnan's life, that's the 700 life, that were preserved in Durham Cathedral. I mentioned Durham a while ago. There is the genealogy of Colmcille, telling us who his parents and brothers and sisters and so on and so forth. And when you translate that manuscript into a table, this is what it looks like. We can see there his father was called Fidelmit, his mother was Ethna, and he had a brother Owen, and then sisters, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into all of that. But Colmcille came from a very important family. Now, sometimes there's a lot of exaggeration in the stories that he could himself have become King of Ireland. Well, that's a fiction. But he certainly came from a very, very powerful family. And this was their headquarters in County Donegal. In fact, the river you can see there in the middle section divides County Donegal from County Tyrone. And that hill is called Croghan Hill. And it was for those of you who know Irish archaeology, the Hill of Tara in County Meath is where the great royal centre, and this was the Donegal equivalent of the Hill of Tara, and there's lots of archaeology and mythology and so on and so forth about that. And then from that hill, his family begins to spread out, and that map shows you the spreading out of the family's influence and power. And the dates on that map are dates of battles in which they expand and extend their control and their power. His mother is an interesting figure. Her name is Ethna, but Ethna was the name of a pre-Christian goddess. And it's very hard to know if that's really her name, or, when we say his mother was Ethna, does that mean he just comes from Ireland? But at any rate, the ancient genealogies tell us that her name was Ethna, and that she came from, in fact, there are several stories about where she came from, but in my opinion, the most reliable is this text, which tells us that she comes from a kingdom called the Corprica of Fanad. And Fanad is the brown area on that map. His own people, the Kenil Connell, come from what is the yellow on that map, but then spread out. So the yellow is his father's people, the brown and the top is his mother's people. And we know roughly where he was born. This is the Gartan area. Gartan is a word which is very close to the English word garden, and it probably means much the same thing, because if you go there now, the whole area is surrounded by mountains, bogs, rough territory, and then there's this little almost island, almost garden of greenery in the middle of it, and 3 lakes. And in that area, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of sites about the early life of Columba. This church, for instance, is probably on the site of his birth, or at least what people thought was the site of his birth in later medieval times. And all sorts of things are in this landscape. For instance, this little island in the lake, just beside the church where I've been showing you, this is, in Irish, it's called the Close Sugar, or the playground of Colmcille. And there was a kind of a taboo that if anybody else went out there to play, because Colmcille was a holy man and a saint, they would lose their fertility, because Colmcille, of course, was a chaste man. And a little bit further out, there are these 2 marks there in the middle, marks just on a rock, just on an ordinary rock in the woods, and it's called in Irish Dimach Colmcille, and that's meant to be, or at least it was believed to be, marks of where Colmcille as a baby first took his first walking steps. So this whole landscape in that area is filled with monuments, filled with stories, all about the birth and the very early life of Colmcille, when he's a baby and when he's a child, not when he's the important saint of later times. But all over Ireland, there are all sorts of places connected with the cult of St. Colmcille. This is Glen Colmcille in South Donegal, about 100 kilometres from where we are now. And all around the edges of the glen, there is a pilgrimage route. And people would move around and they would say prayers of the individual. This is station 2 of Glen Colmcille. In fact, the stone you're looking at is a carved stone of roughly about the 8th century. And then off the coast of Donegal, off the west coast of Ireland, between Ireland and America, is Tory Island. And this again has lots of stories connected with St. Colmcille. On Tory, there are a number of monuments. This is a so-called Tau cross, a T-shaped cross. And but there are lots of other features on the island about the story of Colmcille, monuments to the story. And here on the mainland, just not very far from Tory Island, here is a holy well, Tubber Colmcille, in a place called Ardee near Gortahork. But all over Ireland, there are holy wells, here in Derry and all sorts of places, all over, right down to the very south of the country. There are holy wells dedicated to St. Colmcille. This, in fact, is a map of Derry. The first map we have of Derry, where we're speaking from, it dates to the 27th of December, 1600, and the English have now taken over Derry, and they've built the fortifications, but they've used the ancient buildings, and you can see on the map there to the right-hand side, the remains of the round tower. Round towers were very distinctive features of early Irish monasteries, and there's the one from Derry. And we know that when we study that map in detail, we can figure out several. There's about 5 or 6 different churches on it, ancient churches. And one of those churches, if you like, was rebuilt and built and rebuilt down the centuries. And this is it now, St. Augustine's Church, which is just on the famous city walls of Derry. And this is probably the site of the original Columban monastery in Derry. But nearby, in the middle of that picture, it's a bit dark, but in the middle of the picture, there is another church called the Long Tower. And the Long Tower is just a way of saying the Round Tower. And that, again, was a very important church all through the Middle Ages, and certainly from the 12th century onwards. Now, so there are churches and holy wells and crosses and things like that all over the place in Ireland connected with Colmcille. But there are some odd things, like, for instance, this big rock on the shores of Connemara is known in Irish as Bod Colmcille, Colmcille's boat. It was believed that this was a boat, and that this was used by Colmcille to go out to the Aran Islands out in Galway Bay. And there are other Bod Colmcille. There's one in Glen Colmcille, where you get a rock that looked like a boat, and people would have, if you like, generated those stories about it. This is Swords, a place called Swords. It's, some of you might know, because it's just beside Dublin Airport. If you ever fly into Dublin Airport, you'll be beside Swords. And this is the round tower of the Clugceach. In Irish, those round towers were called Clugceach, which literally means bell tower, because they were bells. And in Irish, Swords, in English it's called Swords, but in Irish the place is called Sword, Colmcille. And in County Kildare, just if you like, about 30 miles from Dublin, there's a place called Moon in English, but in Irish it's Moyne Colmcille. And it has a number of ancient monuments, but among them is an absolutely wonderful cross. And I've just shown you there the base of that cross, which commemorates Colmcille, and it's just a wonderful work of art. Now, as well as these stone sculptures and things like that, that an awful lot of the most important manuscripts from ancient Ireland are connected with the story of Colmcille. You've already heard a lecture in this conference from Professor O'Machan about the Cathach. The Cathach is the oldest Irish manuscript in existence, or oldest illuminated manuscript in existence, and dates to roughly about 600. The tradition is that that manuscript, the handwriting you're actually looking at, is supposed to be the hands of St. Colmcille. And we can't prove it, but we can't disprove it. It's of roughly the right date. And later on, about the 11th century, a special shrine box, known in Irish as a cúdach, was made to hold the Cathach. This was so that it could be venerated. And indeed, when the people of the Lords of Donegal were going into battle, they held this box on their chest. There's a chain to go over their heads, and this would be paraded around the armies of the Donegal lordships when they were going into battle. Other very important manuscripts come from these Columban milieux, such as this. This is the Book of Durrow. Durrow is the only monastery in Ireland that we know for definite that was founded by St. Colmcille. And you're looking there at these books are more or less all gospel books. They're books of the Gospels, and that's the page that introduces the Gospel of St. Mark, the Lion of St. Mark. And even in England, the most important manuscript from England is this one that you're looking at, a page from the Book of Lindisfarne. I mentioned Lindisfarne earlier. It's a little island north of, off the east coast of England, north of Newcastle upon Tyne. And this was one of its most elaborate manuscripts, and shows, if you like, the spread of Columban monasticism across, out of Ireland into Scotland, into England. And then the most famous of all these manuscripts from early Ireland, or indeed these islands, is this one. This is the Book of Kells. It's also nowadays known as the Book of Kells, but in ancient times, Lar Canlish, or the Sushkel, the Gospel of St. Colmcille. And it dates to about the year 810, and it's now on display in Trinity College in Dublin. I'm going to finish up by just using a small quotation about Colmcille. This is kind of a tribute to him. It says, "It is an honour to address you on such an auspicious day, the 9th of June. This is the feast day of St. Columba, who very specially symbolises the historic linkages and deep bonds between Britain and Ireland. Born a prince in Donegal, exiled in Iona, and honoured today in the central lobby of the Palace of Westminster. His monks provided not just an Irish national treasure, the Book of Kells, but also a British national treasure, the Lindisfarne Gospels." Now, if I'm giving lectures, I usually have a kind of ask people a kind of a trick question at the end. Can anybody suggest who might have said that? And I think people are often very surprised, because the man who actually said it was the British Prime Minister, David Cameron. He lost power a few years ago, and he's no longer very popular. But I think there's no better words to finish off this lecture with than the tribute that the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, made to Colmcille a number of years ago. So thank you very much for listening to me.
And Tríú Cainseoir, our third and final speaker, Professor Moirid Nicrai, now joins us from Edinburgh.
Thank you to the ACIS and to Ulster University for the invitation to speak here today. The focus of this session is on Colmcille, Columba, as an icon of shared heritage. And my presentation is going to very much focus on the concept of sharing in a Columban context. One of the first issues I'd like to note is that Columba, or Colmcille, has been a contested symbol. The hint is in the name. Put very simplistically, the saint is known as Colmcille to Catholics and Columba to Protestants. And like many other symbols in Northern Ireland, different ethnic or religious groups have engaged in what Simon Harrison calls claims to ownership, or proprietary contests, in an attempt to confer exclusivity on particular items. This is one of the difficulties frequently encountered by cultural groups living for centuries in the same region. They frequently lay irreconcilable claims to the same symbols of identity. In these circumstances, it is often their similarity rather than their difference that heightens the conflict, as both groups endeavour to accentuate differences and erect distinct dividing walls. Northern Ireland is not unique in this respect. The same applies to the epic ballads of the Albanians and Serbs. In a semi-fictional account of Lord Albert's trip to Albania in the 1930s, Ismail Kadari wrote of these groups that a ballad in one language is like an upside-down version of the same ballad in the other language, a magic mirror, making the hero of one the anti-hero of the other, the black of one, the white of the other, with all the emotions, bitterness, joy, victory, and defeat inverted to the very end. It is not by accident that the story of Columba and Colmcille is with us still today. According to Ingold and Hallam, traditions have to be worked at to be sustained. And the continuity of tradition is due not to its passive inertia, but to its active regeneration, to the task of carrying on. But how is a tradition such as Columba or Colmcille maintained? Previously, it was assumed that such traditions were carried on unchanged from one generation to the next. Nowadays, however, we understand a little better that tradition is not simply carrying on a fixed pattern of behavior, but of keeping going. And the forward movement of keeping going can involve a good measure of creative improvisation. You could compare this to pedestrians in a busy street who have to continually negotiate a path of what Michel de Certeau calls tactical maneuverings. That is through your constant adjustment of your posture and your pace and your bearing to keep up with those you are walking with, while at the same time avoiding strangers coming from a different direction. The improvisation of the Columban tradition has meant that the narrative is shared not just across generations and religious traditions, but also across creative practices. One example I'd like to point to is the Colmcille spiral, which was essentially a spiral of art events and commissions, which reconsidered the legacy of Colmcille for contemporary life. The spiral brought together artists, creative thinkers, and scholars who produced startling new commissions across communities, islands, and traditions. The commemorations included Spiral 1, The Voice, a performance and voice installation by Ciara Conway on the River Foyle, relating to walks by the artist at significant Colmcille sites from Donegal to Derry Londonderry. Spiral 2, a convocation in the Hebrides and Glasgow, when two illuminators creatively documented a journey of thought and inquiry by artists and historians at the edges and then at the centre of Scotland. Spiral 3, The Word. Poets including Sean O'Brien and Colette Bryce worked with digital artists to deliver sound installations in St. Aidan's Church, Bamborough, and on Lindisfarne. Spiral number 4, Ethical Knowledge. This involved early career researchers working with Media Arts Group to explore and present insights on the ethics of knowledge at Bradwell-on-Sea, site of St. Ked's Church. Spiral number 5, The Book, involved artists in South Wales and the English Midlands with strong links to both places, reimagining distant past exchanges between these cultures, exploring text as image, page and margin, edge and centre. And the final spiral, spiral number 6, the object. This was artifacts from the time of Colmcille, which were interpreted in contemporary contexts to produce a set of public installations in Dublin. But how authentic is such sharing across creative practices? Can we say that an object or a poem is as authentic as a statue or an icon of the saint? Yes, I think we can. And here I am drawing on Barber, who observes that a classical musician who plays from a score improvises just as much as a jazz musician who does not. The difference lies in their aims. The former is, as it were, centripetal, aiming for the bullseye, and the latter, centrifugal, aiming to cast wide. As part of the UK City of Culture, there was a new shared narrative with a focus on Colmcille and his return to the city as peacemaker. Now, considering that tradition holds Columba responsible for hundreds of deaths at the Battle of Culdrevna, his recreation as peacemaker is somehow ironic. And yet, it is not without substance, since Colmcille is also hailed as defending Irish bards who were under threat of expulsion at the Convention of Drumcat. One idea presented during the prior consultation process with Derry City Council and ILEX was that of a Christian heritage trail, which we saw last night in that amazing concert. The trail was designed to promote Colmcille as a figure of unity and peace shared between people living on the west and east banks of the River Foyle. The Christian Heritage Trail was designed to embrace different Christian traditions in the city and link together aspects of the city's different Christian-built heritages. Another element of shared strategic importance was the links between rural and urban communities. Another element designed to promote the legacy of Colmcille Columba was a spectacular pageant on the River Foyle, which was reframed as a route to unite rather than divide the city. The promotion material described the event as follows, quote, "From his self-imposed exile on the Isle of Iona, the 6th century legendary monk will return to his beloved city on a 21st century curragh, granting the reborn city his blessing of a new peace for a new age." The reframing of collective memory regarding Colmcille was essentially conducted in the form of a carnival scripted by Frank Cottrell Boyce, who had also written the opening ceremony of London 2012. Also collaborating with Cottrell Boyce was the outdoor arts company Walk the Plank, as well as local people. The concept of carnival, according to Bakhtin, is a chronotype of increased collectivity, active participation, and a sense of belonging in an equal setting. Most importantly, individual differences are hidden behind masks or disguises, and new alter personae are projected. In the example of this pageant commemorating the legacy of Colmcille Columba, there was no evidence of religious divisions. Instead, we celebrated a secular 2-day carnival. The setting offered what Bakhtin called temporary liberation from the prevailing truth and from the established order. To emphasize the secular character of the pageant, Colmcille was presented as a superhero who vanquished the monster with spectacular style in an epic battle between the saint and the monster in front of 40,000 spectators. Walk the Plank's producer noted that the pageant repositioned the city and enabled it to tell a new story about itself in its own words. The fact that historical information on Columba is scant has allowed different traditions to tailor the character to their own style. In a sense, whether the character of Colmcille Columba is historical or fictional is irrelevant for the purpose of tradition bearing, although most of us are inclined to believe in its historical reality. The history of Colmcille Columba continues to be regenerated and remade, and its significance for a sense of place in this city has become layered. In How Myths Die, Levi-Strauss argued against the disappearance of myths. They can be transformed, exhausted even, but they do not disappear. Instead, they can be recreated and reactivated. In the case of Columba Colmcille, one is dealing with a truth story rather than a true version of events. I first heard this distinction from John Bell at Greenbelt, a Christian arts festival in Cheltenham. And it is a legacy that resonates with communities across the divide. And in the post-conflict context, people are learning to hear each other's stories and transform them into a shared understanding of the past. While the saint may have sparked a battle, he has come to be regarded as a man of peace. The sea, which separated him from his home in Ulster, is now portrayed as a unifying rather than a dividing element. And after centuries in exile, the character of Colmcille was welcomed home during the city's status as UK City of Culture. These examples of sharing, and many more that there is not time to mention, have worked well. And in a post-conflict society, there is strong emphasis on sharing. However, whether everyone buys into this sharing is a moot point. And whether the shared symbol appears to everyone is problematic. For some people, respect for different traditions is as important, if not more important, than cultural sharing. There must be some recognition of what Barbara Tedlock calls double consciousness, a recognition of people not living in different worlds, but living differently in the same world. In the case of Northern Ireland, this might mean people becoming more aware of and gaining more respect for different narratives of the legacy of Colmcille Columba, rather than necessarily sharing the same narrative. The programme for the UK City of Culture and many of the celebrations that have happened since have provided an opportunity for local civic and community leaders to wrench the story of Colmcille Columba from separatist inclinations and synthesize it as a creative, shared narrative which can be embraced by different traditions. But like the Peace Bridge, which has two distinct end points, as well as the shared construction across the river, there must be recognition of difference and mutual respect for different traditions, which allows people to respectfully maintain their difference while also finding common ground. Gur maithagad.
Gur céad maithagad as sin a bhairid. Sincerest thanks to Mairead, Brian and Moira for a fantastic collaborative analysis of Colmcille, his life, his influence and his enduring impact on aspects of our shared heritage both locally and globally. A chairde. Acharja, we are privileged to have conference contributions from both the British and the Irish ambassadors to the United States. Offering the first of these two ambassadorial addresses, please welcome Dame Karen Pearce, British Ambassador to the United States.
It's a great pleasure for me to join you virtually from Washington, D.C. in this year's American Conference of Irish Studies. Having looked at the rich and engaging programme and list of other speakers involved, including my Irish colleague here in D.C., Dan Mulhall, I'm sure this has been another superb conference. I'd like to say a big thank you to Professor Malachy O'Neill, Chair of the conference's organising committee and Provost at Ulster University's Magee campus. I'd like to thank him for the invitation to address this conference. Professor O'Neill suggested that I talk about shared British-Irish priorities in the transatlantic relationship, as well as reflections on the role of women in diplomacy, all of which I will come to. But first, I wanted to share some reflections on the central theme of this year's conference: heritage, healing, and home. The last 15 months have been incredibly tough for all of us in different and profound ways. It will take many years for the full toll of the collective trauma we've all experienced because of COVID to be fully understood in dimensions beyond the grim statistics we've all become so familiar with. I arrived in DC here in Washington in March of 2020, just days after the first lockdown was announced. I think the necessity of physical isolation from each other has reminded us all just how much energy and life we draw from a sense of shared cultural heritage that we all feel in various ways. While I'm certainly no great scholar of their work, unlike I think it's fair Ambassador Dan, this is something that Heaney and Friel understood instinctively and which shines through in their writing. We all need the nourishment that a connection to home and heritage provides. This will remain equally as true as we gradually emerge and heal from the hardships of the last year. Of course, it's no coincidence that Heaney, Friel and also John Hume share this, hailing as they all do from the wonderful city of Derry, Londonderry. This is a city with a rich history dating back to the birth of St. Columba in the 6th century and has been suitably recognised internationally as a UNESCO learning city. While the last year has given us all time to reflect on the place of heritage, home and healing in our individual lives, there are also vital parts of the story of the British-Irish-American relationship over the centuries to the present day. For while often complicated and messy, the histories of our countries and peoples are intertwined in incomparable and incalculable ways unlike no other. Our shared heritage finds its most profound expression in our shared values as free and democratic societies. These are the values and principles that are at the very heart of the relationship between the UK, Ireland and the United States, and that define the transatlantic relationship. And I'm delighted that all three of us are on the Security Council. Next week, we'll see what this means in practice as the UK hosts the G7 in Cornwall and President Biden visits the UK on his first international trip as president. So I thought I'd turn to some of the specifics of what shared priorities in the transatlantic relationship look like without giving away the inner secrets of G7. First of all, and I think the preeminent global challenge facing us, is climate change. This is a significant year for the UK, as with Italy, we host COP26. Tackling climate change is our foremost international policy priority this year, and the US plays an integral role in our ability to tackle it effectively, and US entry back into the Paris Agreement is greatly welcomed by both Ireland and the UK. The unique opportunity of holding both G7 and COP26 presidencies offers the chance to galvanise international action and lead innovation in international development, another big priority for Ireland. We'll use the presidency of the G7 to show that the G7 is back, unified and ready to lead to ensure the international system can deliver on our shared climate, nature, and health priorities. The transatlantic relationship is important in action if we're to achieve these goals of securing global net zero emissions by mid-century, protect communities and natural habitats by restoring delicate ecosystems, and building resilient infrastructure. We want to mobilize finance to support this work, and we want to work together to rise to the challenges of the climate crisis. Tackling climate change and promoting sustainability are central themes to both the Prime Minister's and the President's visions of how to build back better from COVID-19. While the UK has left the EU, our fundamental values and priorities have not changed. We remain committed to working with Ireland and our EU partners and the US to push for more ambitious CO2 reductions and make a green and sustainable recovery a reality. In March, our Prime Minister set out the blueprint for how we'll champion our values and support our interests on the world stage. The integrated review of defence, security, development and foreign policy sets out his vision for the UK's international policy for the next decade. Under the title Global Britain in a Competitive Age, the UK seeks to be a problem-solving and burden-sharing nation with a global perspective. We want to work with allies and partners around the world to ensure that free and open societies are able to flourish in the post-COVID order, and I know that Ireland and the US share that goal. The UK government is also pressing ahead with a trade agenda which is unprecedented in scale and speed. We're optimistic that a comprehensive free trade agreement with the US will cement our economic bonds and build new opportunities with old and greatly valued friends. In pursuing a free trade agreement, greater collaboration, greater innovation, and greater liberalisation are necessary to craft an agreement that reflects our 21st century partnership, and the UK government is committed to achieving this. At the same time, we celebrate the TCA that we have achieved with the EU and our partners in Europe. Against all of this backdrop, another shared priority that's closer to home is Northern Ireland. While we work through the technical issues bedeviling the Northern Ireland Protocol with our EU friends, the British, Irish and American governments all share an overriding ambition and objective for a peaceful and prosperous Northern Ireland. At the heart of this is the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which we must all work together to uphold and strengthen, and I'm happy to renew our commitment to the agreement today. Protecting the Good Friday Agreement is something that takes all of us working together to achieve. Recently, the Prime Minister and the TSOC met at Chequers to discuss this, along with wider shared ambitions for the future of the UK-Ireland relationship. Building on this, there are plans for a British-Irish Council and a British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference later this month, and for regular ministerial engagement between both governments. All of this provides an opportunity to refresh and reinvigorate the bilateral relationship between the UK and Ireland. The trilateral relationship also remains key here as well. The US has long supported peace in Northern Ireland, and this dates right back to the mid-80s when the role of a US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland was initially discussed. Senator George Mitchell became the first Special Envoy in 1995. I remember meeting him when I was in DC then, and his legacy endures today. He successfully chaired the talks that led to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Northern Ireland's progress is real, but it remains still fragile. The United Kingdom is deeply invested in helping Northern Ireland reach its full potential in terms of peace, stability and prosperity, including through reconciliation with its past. We also recognise the tireless and groundbreaking work of the many Americans who've played a role in delivering and then safeguarding the peace. It took deep partnership between the UK, Ireland and the US to bring the troubles to an end, and it will take a renewed and ongoing partnership to safeguard Northern Ireland's stability and prosperity into the future. This partnership is most effective when any interventions are balanced across community interests in Northern Ireland. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement also continues to be the cornerstone of Northern Ireland's governance. It's an achievement of which Ireland, the UK, and the US are justifiably proud. We continue to work closely with our partners in Dublin and Washington to secure the hard-won gains from the peace process and help Northern Ireland move forward, particularly as it recovers from the pandemic, which has sadly hit its economy hard. Our shared priorities on Northern Ireland have also seen the enduring commitment by the US and Ireland in support of the International Fund for Ireland. The fund was established by the British and Irish governments through the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1986. It continues to do excellent work, promoting economic and social advance, as well as encouraging contact between unionists and nationalists throughout the island of Ireland. To date, the fund has supported over 6,000 projects in Northern Ireland and the border areas of Ireland. Its continued efforts in supporting communities in these challenging times will be vitally important. The transatlantic relationship is thus critical to supporting and addressing so many global as well as local interests and shared objectives. We've all had an incredibly challenging time of late, but it has not distracted us from working together in partnership to address shared concerns. I look forward to continuing this relationship and to strengthening our bonds yet further. Speaking personally, and with one of the themes of the conference, Women of Knowledge, in mind, the role of women should be essential to the work of realising all of these shared ambitions in the years ahead. And I know that with Ireland on the Security Council, the cause of women, peace and security will be advanced. This also correlates with the themes of our shared values and shared priorities, and women need to be at the centre of that. So I thought it might be helpful if I provide some background to women in diplomacy within the British Foreign Office. It wasn't until 1946 that women were first admitted into the UK diplomatic corps. It took a further 27 years for Britain's first female head of mission to be appointed and to take up that appointment. Eleanor Emery was High Commissioner to Botswana in 1973. By 1995, and I'd already joined by then, we had only 3 female ambassadors and 5 female senior grade officers in the Foreign Office. In 2020, our fast stream intake was 60% female, and the 2020 edition of the Women Leaders Index worked the UK third among EU, G20 and OECD countries in the percentage of senior civil servants who are women, 44.7%, just behind Canada and Australia. It's worth noting that today, nearly a third of Britain's ambassadors, heads of mission and governors, including almost all of the highest profile ambassadorial posts round the network, are women. Globally, women make up only 24% of representatives in national parliaments and less than 10% of heads of state. Having women in leadership positions has far-reaching benefits, as I saw in the UN in both Geneva and New York when I worked alongside some incredible women in Patricia O'Brien and in Geraldine, who was my long-standing counterpart in the UN, in the General Assembly, and I am sorry not to be serving with her on the Security Council. States where women hold more political power are less likely to go to war, less likely to commit human rights abuses. A higher proportion of women in legislatures is also associated with a positive impact on levels of public health spending. And the final point I wish to make is that women's leadership has also been found to significantly enhance business performance, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility, as women bring new ideas and dimensions to problem solving. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I wish the American Conference for Irish Studies every best wish for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearce, for that thoughtful and insightful reflection on British, Irish and US relations and on key aspects of our shared heritage. Transferring now to the Irish Embassy in Washington, we welcome Dan Mulhall, Irish Ambassador to the United States.
It's a pleasure for me, as Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, to speak at this event, this annual event organised by the American Conference for Irish Studies. I've had a lot of contact with the ACIS over the past number of years. In particular, they helped me to organise a series of centenary reflections on the coming of Irish independence, a series called A Farther Shore, which I was able to organise with the support and assistance of the ACIS, its various regional branches, and of course the wonderful Irish Studies Centres that exist all across the United States. Now, my topic today is Ireland and America, past, present, and future. I've now been in America as ambassador for almost 4 years. And this seems to me like a good time to look back and take stock of Ireland's many, many connections with the United States, and also to spend a little time envisaging what future course our relations might take in the years and decades ahead. Now, I've seen America in different manifestations, politically and economically. I've been here under two US administrations. I arrived here in August of 2017, and obviously I was here for the most of the Trump administration, and now I've been here for 5 months during the Biden administration. So I've seen America at a time of outright Republican control between 2017 and 2019, of divided government between 2019 and 2021, and of Democrat control of the White House and of both houses of Congress since January of this year. My time has been characterized in America by deep political divisions in Congress and in the country, which appears to be continuing in the current, at this present time. I've also seen the Irish economy, the US economy in different phases. I've seen the economy boom in the first few years of my time here. I saw it go into reverse under the weight of the pandemic, and now I'm observing the US economy in recovery mode. So throughout these eventful past 4 years, one constant has been the US interest in Ireland and in the Irish peace process. Also, I've been uplifted by the affection which so many Americans show for Ireland. And this is to be found not just in the traditional places like Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, but all over the United States, wherever I've been in this country. And then I've also been here during a time of impressive growth in the Irish involvement in the US economy, which has turned our transatlantic ties into a genuinely mature partnership. Now, as a historian by training and inclination, I know, of course, that present-day realities, which are very strong and impressive, did not materialize out of thin air. They have a deep and rich past, and they are situated. They are anchored in the past, in the history of Irish-American relations going back centuries. In the case of Irish-America, that past was played out in two countries, Ireland and America. And what a rich pageant it has been. While the Irish contribution to the United States was by no means unique, as there are multiple strands through America's immigrant history, the Irish undoubtedly made their mark in a big way on 19th and 20th century America. And they continue to this day to have a powerful influence here. You only have to note the fact that President Joe Biden is probably the most Irish president of the United States since John F. Kennedy. And all over the United States, in every walk of life, you find people of Irish heritage and descent in positions of great prominence. Now, the Irish-American story really took off like a rocket in the second half of the 19th century. And it's as if Ireland and the United States were made for each other. On the one hand, in Ireland, you had a nation driven by circumstances to emigration. And on this side of the Atlantic, you had a nation driven by immigration. So in a sense, the two countries were made for each other. They were entirely compatible, because at a time when the Irish were driven to emigrate, the United States was being driven forward by the immigration of millions of people into this country in the second half of the 19th century. And it cannot be a coincidence that the American economy was transformed in the way it was in the 50 years after the American Civil War. And that transformation came about at a time when immigration from Ireland and elsewhere was at its peak. In the mid-1880s, for example, the Irish-born and those of Irish extraction made up 40%, 40%, of New York's population. And the US economy grew 12-fold between the late 1860s and the mid-1890s, when immigration from Ireland and elsewhere in Europe was running at record levels. Now, a feature of the Irish community in the United States was the extent to which it continued to identify strongly with the travails of its ancestral homeland. This was because the Irish arrived here in the aftermath of the Great Famine with a sense of grievance at the circumstances which had brought about their departure from Ireland. And that appears to have been passed down through the generations. And you still meet people who tell you that their Irish heritage really was derived from grandparents who told them stories that they heard from their grandparents about the early years of mass Irish immigration to the United States in the second half of the 19th century. The extent to which the Irish were viewed as outsiders and treated with a degree of hostility also encouraged them to band together to defend their interests. And this gave them a sense of community cohesion that was perhaps an asset to them. It also, of course, made them aware and gave them an incentive to embrace the opportunities afforded by political activism in an age of increasing democracy in the United States. The number of Irish immigrants here meant that they had political influence in this country in a way that they didn't have in the country they came from. They came from where political circumstances were very different because of Ireland's being part of the United Kingdom and being a minority part of the United Kingdom, and therefore Irish interests overruled by the majority in the Westminster Parliament. So quickly, early on, the Irish embraced the opportunities available of political activism to defend and enhance their position in the country where they had arrived in large numbers in the period after the Great Famine. So the Irish in America were a source of support for their homeland, and they made a significant contribution to the advent of Irish independence. Visits to America by Irish political figures were commonplace in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And those visitors found in America deep wells of support, moral and financial, for their causes. Just to give one example, Gaelic League President Douglas Hyde, future President of Ireland, spent 7 months touring the USA in 1906 and 1907, where he raised significant funds from among Irish Americans to support the work of the Gaelic League in trying to revive the Irish language in Ireland. And it has been argued many times, I think convincingly, that Irish independence would perhaps not have come about in the way it did, but for the influence of Irish Americans on the politics and the nationalist tradition in Ireland. But I suppose the contemporary Irish-American story, in a way, begins with the visit of President John F. Kennedy to Ireland in the summer of 1963. I'm old enough to remember that particular summer when John F. Kennedy came to our shores. And I think that visit signaled that Irish America had come of age in terms of influence at the very top of the American system. It provided proof that the Irish could rise to the top and could be powerful figures within 20th century America. Later on, the conflict in Northern Ireland brought the influence of Irish Americans gradually into play. That brings me to a key point I want to make. On account of the labors of Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, George Mitchell, and many, many others over the years, all of it masterfully encouraged by that great dairyman, John Hume, America, and especially Irish America, came to see itself as having a genuine stake in the Irish peace process. Irish Americans, I've discovered, take genuine pride in the contribution the United States made to the coming of the Good Friday Agreement and all that flowed from that historic achievement. That interest is strong and, in my view, persistent. The American interest in Northern Ireland and in Ireland generally is something to be actively encouraged, in my view, because it's a positive factor. But it would exist even if we in Ireland were indifferent to it. We're not. It is largely self-sustaining because it stems from the values and interests of people of Irish heritage in the United States who want to be proud of the land of their ancestors and want to be helpful to Ireland in any way they can. I saw this concern at first hand when I traveled around the United States, in particular during 2019, and was invariably probed everywhere I went about the implications of Brexit for Ireland, and in particular for the open border on the island of Ireland, which so many Irish Americans saw as a crucial achievement of the past few decades, and one they did not want to see interfered with by Brexit. We saw this Irish American concern for Ireland in action 2 years ago when Speaker Pelosi visited Ireland with a delegation drawn from the House Ways and Means Committee chaired by Congressman Richie Neal, and which included a man with Donegal, strong Donegal heritage, Congressman Brendan Boyle, who I know is a speaker at this week's conference also. And the strong statements that Speaker Pelosi made in London, Dublin, Belfast, and Derry to the effect that if the Brexit process were to damage the Good Friday Agreement or create a hard border on the island of Ireland, a potential UK-US trade deal would not make it through Congress. Those forthright comments on the part of the Speaker had a material effect, I believe, had an influence on the negotiations, which finally led to the agreement that was reached last December, including the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that position continues to be the position of the American administration and of Congress. And it's a bipartisan position, by the way. It's not just a position held by Democratic members of Congress. It's held across the board. It's a bipartisan point of view. It's because support for the Good Friday Agreement and all that's flowed from it is something that Republicans and Democrats definitely share. We've had recent examples of that. There was a number of resolutions passed unanimously in the House of Representatives and the Senate in recent times. Although it would be unwise to be complacent about American interest in Ireland, I do not see that as likely to wane anytime soon, for it is deeply embedded. It's part of the identity of many Americans to have this interest in Ireland and a concern for the fate of Ireland, in particular for our peace process. Many prominent Americans of Irish descent care deeply about what happens in Ireland, and that really matters. In recent months, members of the Friends of Ireland have been urging adherence to the Northern Ireland Protocol and have been critical of unilateral moves that threaten to undermine the protocol and thus put the open border in Ireland in some jeopardy. Now, our contemporary relationship with the United States rests on more than just a concern for Northern Ireland and its peace process that exists very strongly here in the United States. After decades of economic engagement, we now have a genuinely mature two-way partnership between Ireland and the United States, anchored in substantial flows of trade and investment between us. Ireland is a significant asset to the US economy. That is why more than 750 US companies have chosen Ireland as a base for their operations within the European Union. Especially now that the UK has left the EU, Ireland represents an optimal European location for US multinationals who need to locate some of their activities in Europe in order to be genuinely global companies. In order to be cutting-edge companies, they need to have bases around the world, including, importantly, in the European Union. And Ireland offers an ideal location for those companies. Ireland has proven to be a happy place for US firms, from which they can access the world's largest market, and also a highly educated English-speaking workforce, and where they have a long-standing record of success. Significant profits from Irish subsidiaries are repatriated to the US from Ireland each year to the benefit of the US economy. While the transatlantic investment flow was once a one-way street from the US to Ireland, that is certainly no longer the case. Today, Irish-owned companies employ some 110,000 people across the United States, and Ireland is now in the top 10 countries in terms of foreign investment in the USA. In my view, it will not be long before more Americans are employed by Irish companies than there are Irish people employed by American companies. That would have been unthinkable even a short time ago, but given the expansion of Irish investment in the United States, with something like 70 or 80 companies coming in fresh to the US market every year, that is no longer an unreasonable prediction for the future. I sometimes hear criticism from commentators here of Ireland's corporate tax system, but this, in my view, is misguided and is based on a lack of understanding of Ireland's economic model. It is lazy analysis to attribute Ireland's economic transformation to a single factor, when it is in fact the product of a complex network of elements that have been operating for more than 6 decades. In particular, our investment in education, our investment in upgrading our national infrastructure, and the consistent growth of growth-friendly policies by successive Irish governments, and of course, our membership of the European Union. Those factors, alongside our open and transparent corporate tax system, have enabled Ireland to achieve a situation which would have been unthinkable not long ago. And it's enabled us to move from being a country racked by emigration for decades and even centuries, to a country that now attracts people from different parts of Europe and beyond. A country in which some 17% of our population is now born outside Ireland, and a country which has also proved to be a tolerant, open, progressive society, which has been able to do things that would be difficult to achieve in other countries, such as a referendum with a resounding majority in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage. Another Irish-US dimension I have seen grow in recent times is the educational and scientific connection. Today, Ireland is a hub for international education. We welcome the largest number of US study abroad students per capita of any country in the world, approximately 12,000 American students per year before COVID, and I hope we will get back to that situation very soon. Over the last 25 years, Ireland has invested heavily in research and development and innovation. Our focus has been on public investment into areas where Ireland can add real value, like ICT, health, sustainable food and energy, advanced manufacturing and business processes. Since the late 1990s, the number of R&D active firms in Ireland has gone from 800 to 1,800 today. And their investment in research has increased tenfold during that time, from 300 million euros to 3.5 billion in that short space of time. This incredible journey in R&D has a distinct US connection. Ireland's research champion, Science Foundation Ireland, was modeled on America's National Science Foundation, and the two organizations enjoy a close and fruitful relationship. With over 450 academic collaborations and 250 industry collaborations with significant US employers in Ireland. So there's now a really rich network of scientific and research connections that go across the Atlantic, both between academic institutions, but also between industry. However, there's no getting away from the fact that the prime driver, the most important factor in the Irish-US relationship continues to be the Irish diaspora in the United States, now numbering 33 million people in the last census, but I think probably more than that, because a lot of people are now discovering through Ancestry and 23andMe and DNA research into their backgrounds that many people who didn't know they had an Irish background are now discovering that they have one. For me, contact with our diaspora across this country has been a highlight of my time in America. What has impressed me about our diaspora is its fidelity to Ireland and its Irish heritage, even in the case of those descended from 19th century Irish immigrants, and also the diversity, geographical and otherwise, of the Irish presence in the United States. I've come across communities proud of their heritage, not just in the traditional centers with historically large concentrations of Irish immigrants and their descendants, not just in New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, but in Savannah, in Charleston, South Carolina, in San Antonio, Texas, in San Diego, California, in Seattle, Washington, in Cincinnati and Cleveland, Ohio, in Indianapolis, in Indiana, in Kansas City, Missouri, in Denver, Colorado, in Vermont, in Portland, Maine, in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia. I could go on and on and on. My point is that the Irish are to be found all over America. Approximately 10% of all Americans have an Irish heritage. Another aspect of our diaspora was illustrated last year with the setting up of an African-American Irish diaspora network, whose founders reckon that as many as 38% of today's African-American community may have some Irish heritage. We've also seen LGBTI communities identifying with Ireland, and the embassy and our consulates, we've been happy to support and proud to support Pride activities, Pride Month activities over the last number of years, recognizing the diversity of the Irish diaspora. As someone who has been 40 years plus in the Irish Foreign Service, I have seen considerable change in recent years in the manner in which we relate to our diaspora. While there may have been a degree of official complacency in the past with regard to our diaspora, that is certainly not the case today. Through our diaspora strategy, the appointment of a Minister of State dedicated to cultivating links with our diaspora, and the creation of an immigrant support program, we've been able to channel genuine support to Irish organizations worldwide, including here in the United States. And for example, when the pandemic erupted last year, we were able to provide support for Irish organizations and vulnerable Irish people across the United States. And we were able to draw on the resources of a rich network of Irish organizations to ensure that Irish people who needed support were able to get whatever support the embassy and our government was able to provide at that difficult time. The challenge for the future, it seems to me, stems from societal changes on both sides of the Atlantic. Ireland has undergone a transformation of really dramatic scale, and it makes our country unrecognizable to many older Irish Americans who may have grown up with more traditional impressions of Ireland derived from grandparents and so on. And there was much work to be done by our diplomatic network in explaining Ireland to people of Irish descent around this country. But we're extremely well placed to do that because we now have 7 consulates plus the embassy all over the United States. We'll have an 8th consulate next year, hopefully, when we open in Miami. And that means that by the standards of countries other than the very large countries, we will have a more extensive network than almost any other country. Apart from the UK, US, and France, I reckon Ireland will have the biggest consular network of any European country in America by this time next year. And therefore, we are now in a position to reach out to our diaspora, to the diversity of our diaspora, to people of Hispanic origin who also have Irish connections, and there are many of those, to people of different ethnic backgrounds who also have an Irish heritage within their family background. It's important that we reach out beyond, but the traditional Irish diaspora will continue to be, of course, the mainstay of our efforts here in the United States. Irish America is also changing, and it would be unreasonable for us to expect Irish America to have a monolithic outlook. We need to accept the fact that our diaspora is possessed of a range of social, economic, and political experiences and perspectives. We do not have a monopoly in defining what it means to be Irish American. We can contribute, of course, to that definition, but Irish American identity is an American phenomenon, and we have to accept that. It's an American phenomenon that's connected with Ireland. We have to respect its diversity, and we have to respect the right of Irish Americans to define their Irishness in the way that meets their needs and serves to underpin their sense of identity. But I do expect in the future years that we will continue and even step up our engagement with the Irish diaspora. The challenge for us is clearly going to be engaging with future generations in a rapidly changing environment. And in particular, I believe we have to draw on the resources of technology and communications in particular, because it makes it easier for people to connect across the Atlantic. Those connections that would have been impossible even a generation ago are now more than possible through the virtual space that all of us have become so accustomed to in recent years. And I know that there are Irish American communities all over this country who are now linked back to Ireland in very meaningful ways, in ways that wouldn't have been possible before, because they can do this virtually. It's also the case, of course, that travel, well, at least before the pandemic, and that will go back to being the case before too long, but the ease of travel and the relatively less expensive travel opportunities that are now available to people. The fact that, again, before the pandemic and in the future, again, there are 20 plus cities in America connected directly with Ireland. This makes it easier for Irish Americans, and many more Irish Americans now visit Ireland on a more regular basis and don't just wait until they retire to visit Ireland and go once. They maybe go repeatedly. And the interest in Irish culture and so on is very strong among younger people in particular, who actually value what Ireland has to offer in the cultural space. I want to say that I believe that Irish studies has an important part to play in the future development of Irish-American relations. We in Ireland are indeed very fortunate to have a community of scholars around the world, but particularly here in the United States, with a deep interest in Ireland and Irish affairs. And I want to encourage that interest because it's a huge asset to Ireland, because no part of the world, no country has a monopoly on wisdom. And you, the members of ACIS, operating all over the United States, you help Americans to understand Ireland, but you help us to understand ourselves because of the work you do, the research you do, the resources that you can bring to bear on Irish studies. And as an enthusiast for Irish history and literature, I have been dazzled in traveling around the United States to see the holdings of Irish material available in American universities and institutions. I have lost count of the number of first editions of James Joyce's Ulysses that I've seen in different parts in libraries all over this country. It's a huge help to Ireland to have an international perspective, because it would be very easy for our country to become insular. We are, after all, an island people. But because of our connections around the world with Irish communities and with scholars that have an interest in Ireland, we can avoid the trap of insularity. So I look forward to continuing to work closely with ACIS, with its branches and its members all over the United States and in Ireland. We're on a journey. That journey is taking us into a future which is uncertain, but I believe that future will serve to reinforce rather than reduce the links between Ireland and the United States. Because at the macro level, our two countries now have shared interests and shared values that are not universally accepted, that will need to be argued for, that will need to be campaigned for, that cannot be taken for granted. We might have 20 years ago believed that the values of democracy, pluralism, tolerance, and so on were going to be invincibly victorious in the world of the future. We can no longer guarantee that. And therefore, the things that bind us are more important than ever. And we will have to combine our activities, our resources across the Atlantic, not just between Ireland and America, but between the European Union and America, if we are to ensure that the future that's being made is a future that fits in with the values and the interests of Europeans and Americans, of Irish people and Americans. I'm glad that we have a very good dialogue with the American administration. Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Coveney recently had very good meetings at Shannon Airport with the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and with the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and we're working closely with the United States in the context of our current membership of the United Nations Security Council, where Ireland has been charged with responsibility for a number of files that are part of the agenda of the Security Council that are of significant interest to the United States: humanitarian support for Syria, climate and security, and indeed, the UN resolutions to do with Iran. So there's a lot that's on the agenda that connects Ireland and America in very meaningful and positive ways. And as ambassador, I celebrate and I am very happy to see that that relationship moving forward in the way it has. But I do think that Irish studies in the United States has an important agenda. I know that the focus has been a lot on history and literature, and I fully subscribe to that as a historian and someone who's got a lifelong interest in Irish literature. I'm due to publish a book on James Joyce's Ulysses next year, reflecting my lifetime's interest in Irish literature, and in particular in the work of James Joyce and W.B. Yeats. But I do think that a focus for Irish studies in the United States and elsewhere ought to be on modern Ireland as an example of a country that has been reshaped by globalization, that has been transformed by taking advantage of the opportunities of free flows of trade, investment, people, and capital, and that has embraced that phenomenon of globalization, while at the same time avoiding those viruses of anti-immigrant sentiment excessive populism and resistance to economic developments. Many parts of the world have experienced difficulties, and political upheavals have come in the wake of the economic changes brought about by globalization. Ireland is an example of a country that has embraced those challenges and has come out the other end, at least at this stage, unscathed and not tempted to go down the road of anti-immigrant nativist populism. And that is something that I think we can be proud of. It's not something I'm complacent about in any way, but I do believe that the reasons why Ireland has managed to achieve this outcome for ourselves at this stage of economic transformation, combined with progressive and tolerant and open attitudes towards the world around us, is something that deserves further study. And I hope that that our studies professionals around America and elsewhere will start to look at the reasons why Ireland has managed this transformation in the way we've done. So with that, I will say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference. It's really appreciated by me and by my colleagues at the Embassy, and I wish you all the very best and look forward to continued engagement with the Irish Studies community across the United States. Thank you very much.
Gurkid Moigat Ambassador. Sincere thanks to Ambassador Mulhall for that spirited and poetic contribution, which is greatly appreciated by us all. Míle buíochas as sin.